Discovery. Let us think about this word for a moment. On March 16, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan discovered the Philippines, as if our islands and our people had never existed, as if they were absolutely isolated from the rest of the world, until this guy showed up and said, "I found you, now you belong to my king." But how exactly do you discover a place where people had already been living in for at least 700,000 years? So today, let us play with this idea of discovery itself. Let us test the word, look at it from different angles, different perspectives. Let us investigate this entire idea about the discovery of what is now the Philippines. Mabuhay! Earn Kamampangan, luwid kayo! Welcome to my channel. It's me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. So if the word discovery means exactly what it's supposed to mean, being the first to find something that no one has ever found or seen before, then who exactly were the first humans to discover the islands we now call the Philippines? Because here's the thing, we actually don't even know exactly what they were. In 2018, a team of archaeologists published findings that stunned the scientific world. On the island of Luzon in the Kalinga province of northern Philippines, they uncovered dozens of stone tools and the butchered bones of a rhinoceros, cut marks, smashed bones, cracked open for marrow, clear evidence that someone was living here, hunting here, eating here. The dating came back at 709,000 years old. Let that sink in. 709,000 years ago, an ancient human species was butchering rhinoceros on the island of Luzon. And we still don't even know exactly which species. This is before us, Homo sapiens, even existed as a species. We're talking about a time so ancient that researchers cannot yet even identify who these people were. They just know they were here, that they existed. Then in Calao Cave, also in northern Luzon, archaeologists found something else. Bones and teeth, dating back approximately 67,000 years. And when they studied them, they realized these remains didn't belong to any known human species. They belonged to a completely new one, the Homo luzonensis, a species found nowhere else on Earth, unique to these islands. And then, there's also Tabon Man, the oldest known remains of a modern human, of Homo sapiens in the Philippines, that was found in the caves of Palawan, dating back roughly 47,000 years. So here's where we are. 709,000 years of human presence, multiple species of humans, some we can't even identify yet, a species that evolved here on our islands and existed nowhere else on the planet, and tens of thousands of years of modern human life on these islands. If we're being honest about the word discovery, if it means finding something that no one else has ever found or seen before, then these islands were discovered hundreds of thousands of years ago by people whose names we'll never know, from species we're still trying to identify. But finding a place is not the same as building something there, because the next wave of people or humans who came to these islands didn't just show up, they built an entire world. Now we know humans have been on these islands for at least 709,000 years. But who actually built the cultures, the languages, the seafaring traditions that we now know and recognize as indigenous to the Philippines? Among the oldest continuous populations in the Philippines are the Indigenous Aetas and other Negrito peoples. They have been here for tens of thousands of years, long before anyone else arrived. Their cultures, their knowledge of the land, their traditions, these are among the deepest roots in the entire archipelago. And they are still here, still living amongst us, still carrying that ancient knowledge every day. In fact, I myself have a direct Aeta ancestry. And yet, despite being the oldest continuous peoples in these islands, the Indigenous Aetas and other Negrito communities have been pushed to the margins, displaced from their ancestral lands, underrepresented, and too often erased from the very history they helped begin. But then, sometime around 5,000 years ago, something massive happened. A great wave of migration swept across the islands of Southeast Asia and the vast Pacific Ocean. The Austronesian expansion. This was not, just people moving around from one island to another. The Austronesians were master navigators. They read the stars, the currents, the winds, and everything around them. They built boats and they sailed thousands of miles across open ocean, from Taiwan through the Philippines, across Indonesia, all the way to Madagascar off the coast of Africa, and eastward to the islands of Polynesia, including Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island off the coast of South America. This was the greatest seafaring migration the world had ever seen, arguably the greatest exploration in the entire history of humanity, long before the modern age. And in the Philippines, the Austronesians didn't just pass through. They settled, they built, the languages we speak today. Tagalog, Kapampangan, Binisaya, Ilocos, Bicol, Magindanaoan, Maranao, Bahasa Sug, and so many more, over 100 more. These are all indigenous Austronesian languages. The barangay communities, the balangay boats, the seafaring culture, the weaving, the oral traditions, the indigenous tattoos, and so many more. All of this traces back to the Austronesian expansion. Let's circle back on our word discovery again. Can you really discover a place where an entire civilization was built, with its own languages, its own seafaring traditions, its own way of life? At this point, the word discovery is starting to look a bit absurd. But then again, maybe it's not about who was there first. Maybe it's about the rest of the world finding out about you. So when exactly did the outside world first learn that the Philippines existed? Now the answer is way earlier than most people think. Okay, so a lot of people today would guess that the outside world first learned about the Philippines when it was discovered by Magellan in 1521. But the thing is, they would be off by at the very least, 600 years, centuries. The Philippines was connected to the outside world long before anyone wrote it down. In the caves of Palawan, archaeologists have found trade goods from as far as Vietnam. In Batangas, they found tens of thousands of jade artifacts sourced all the way from what is now Taiwan. These were all part of a vast, thriving maritime trade network that stretched across Southeast Asia for nearly 3,000 years. In fact, Chinese ceramics from the Tang Dynasty have turned up at numerous sites across the archipelago. And by the year 972, Chinese records were already mentioning a place called Mai, a trading kingdom in the Philippines, sending merchants all the way to China. Indian influence ran just as deep. Sanskrit loanwords are still embedded in Philippine languages today. Hindu-Buddhist concepts shaped how our ancestors organized their societies, their politics, their understanding of the world, of the universe. And the Kavi script, a writing system from Java, rooted in the Brahmic scripts of India, was being used across maritime Southeast Asia. That same Kavi script showed up on something nobody expected to find. So around 1987, a worker dredging the Lumbang River in Laguna pulled out a thin sheet of copper, roughly the size of a piece of printer paper today, covered in ancient writing that nobody could read. So for years, it sat unstudied. But when scholars finally deciphered it, what they found was extraordinary. And I've actually made several videos about this copper plate, including a deep dive in 2025. But here's a short version. The Laguna Copper Plate Inscription, or LCI, was dated to the year 900 CE. The text mixes Old Malay, Sanskrit, Old Javanese, and traces of both Old Kapampangan and Old Tagalog. It is not a poem nor a prayer. It is a legal document, a formal debt pardon, issued by the ruler of Tondo, involving kingdoms across Luzon, Mindanao, and as far as Java, in what is now Indonesia. It was a multilingual legal document from the year 900, over 600 years before Magellan. And Tondo was not alone. Across the archipelago, kingdoms like Butuan in Mindanao were sending diplomatic and trade missions directly to the Chinese imperial court. And these were not random encounters. These were deliberate, sustained official relationships built over centuries. So the Philippines was not some unknown cluster of islands hiding in the vast Pacific Ocean. It was a very well-known, active, established part of a global network, trading, exchanging cultures, sending diplomats, and drafting legal documents in multiple languages, centuries before Magellan discovered our islands. But keep in mind that the year 980, it's not, the absolute beginning of our people's history. This document, this copper plate, is simply the oldest known calendar-dated document we found so far in our islands. I mean, who knows what else is buried out there, waiting for us to rediscover, only if we dig deeper into our roots. The truth is, our people were not just surviving in these islands. We were a thriving maritime seafaring civilization, already making a mark on the global stage. You can't really discover a place or something that was already doing business with half the world. But knowing about a place existing is one thing. What if that connection went even deeper, even further than trade and diplomacy? What if the Philippines was not just known to the outside world, but was actively and deliberately woven into it? So the islands we now call the Philippines was already connected, to China, to India, to the Arab world, to Java, and beyond for centuries. But the depth of that connection goes even deeper than most people realize. And for many of us, this history hits closer to home. Arab and Muslim traders had been traveling throughout Southeast Asia for centuries. And when Islam reached the southern islands of the Philippines, it didn't arrive through conquest. It did not arrive through force. It arrived through people, through relationships, through trade, marriage, diplomacy, through organic human connection. In fact, the Sultanate of Sulu, one of the most important political entities in the history of the Philippines and maritime Southeast Asia, was founded through this process. It was not an outside power imposing itself on the islands. It was built through integration. Indigenous local leaders, Arab traders, and Islamic scholars forming alliances, intermarrying, and creating a new political and spiritual order rooted in the islands. The same goes for the Kingdom of Lusong or Luzon and the Sultanate of Brunei. Royal houses intermarried, political alliances were forged, and they were not the only ones. Across Southeast Asia, royal houses were intermarrying, from Maguindanao to the Moluccas, from Butuan to Java, and beyond. In fact, the rulers of Luzon, Sulu, and Brunei were connected by blood, by marriage, by shared histories, by shared cultures. This was a web of relationships, an intricate web of kinship that stretched across the entire maritime world of Southeast Asia. And my own roots traces back to these lineages. In fact, unknown to most Filipinos today, many of them may have personal connections to this history. These are not just some, abstract stories from some distant past, or some fun facts in a trivia. These histories have direct personal connections to us. Now, these were just some of the kingdoms. Across the archipelago, dozens of polities and kingdoms, sultanates and city-states, from Pangasinan to Namayan, from Mai to Cebu, from Tondo to Sulu, were all trading with the rest of the world. From Japan to Korea, from India to the Arab world and beyond. So going back to our word again, discovery. Discovery implies that something was hidden, that something needed to be found, that someone from the outside came and revealed a place to the entire world for the very first time. But the Philippines was never hidden. It was deeply, deliberately, and actively woven into global networks, political, economic, spiritual, all interconnected by the choice of its own people, our own ancestors. Nobody needed to come and find it. It was already connected, already civilized and thriving. It was already part of the known world. And honestly, we're barely scratching the surface. There's so many more kingdoms, so many more polities, connections, and so many more stories of our people that have been buried and forgotten. And that is why I'm writing an entire book about them, Forgotten Kingdoms of the Sea, demystifying the islands we now call the Philippines. So if you want to help us uplift the histories of our people, please keep an eye out for our Kickstarter launching very soon. So this whole story about the discovery of the Philippines is not holding up too well. But there is one more thing, one more argument that people cling to, that at least Ferdinand Magellan was the first European to discover our islands, right? That even if the Philippines was known to Asia, the Arab world, India, and beyond for centuries, at the very least, Ferdinand Magellan was the very first European to encounter our ancestors, the first European to discover our islands existed, right? Well, not exactly. Not even that holds up. In 1511, the Portuguese launched an invasion and eventually conquered the Sultanate of Malacca in what is now Malaysia. This was a full decade before Magellan's expedition even reached the Visayas in 1521. Now, in the 1500s, Malacca was one of the most important trading ports in the entire world. And among the most prominent communities already thriving in Malacca were the Luzones from the Kingdom of Lusong. Now, for those who may not know, the Kingdom of Lusong or Luzon was a thalassocracy. It was a maritime trading power centered around Manila Bay. And during this time, they were predominantly Kapampangan. In fact, their name Lusong is actually where the Spaniards would later get the name for the entire island of Luzon. Now, the Luzones were well known in Malacca. They were merchants, warriors, political players. For example, one Luzones official named Surya de Raja was sending 175 tons of pepper to China every year, and his massive fleet actually guided the very first Portuguese envoys to the Chinese Empire. In short, they introduced the Portuguese to the Chinese. Another Luzones named Regimo di Raja held the title of Temengong, the Sea Lord of Malacca, one of the most powerful positions in the entire region during this time. He commanded a fleet that protected international trade across the Indian Ocean, the Strait of Malacca, and the South China Sea. And it wasn't just in Malacca. The Luzones were fighting in wars and winning battles from Sumatra in what is now Indonesia to Ayutthaya in what is now Thailand, commanding armies and fleets across the region, a well-known military force across Southeast Asia. In fact, the Portuguese didn't just encounter them in 1511. They actively sought alliances with the Luzones because the Luzones were that influential in the region. Now guess who was among the Portuguese soldiers in Malacca back in 1511? I'll give you a second to guess. The answer is none other than Ferdinand Magellan himself. Unknown to many, Magellan lived in Southeast Asia for years. He was in fact in Malacca alongside the Luzones long before he reached the Visayas. He almost certainly knew about the Luzones, about Luzon, about the islands, about our people, a full decade before he, quote-unquote, discovered the Philippines. And it is not just Magellan. The Portuguese apothecary Tome Pires wrote about the Luzones in his book, Suma Oriental, an extensive account of Asia and the maritime world, written between 1512 and 1515. Tome Pires described the Luzones as wealthy traders, skilled warriors, and prominent figures in Southeast Asian commerce. This was, years before Magellan's expedition even left Spain. So think about it. Even this whole argument about the first European discovery of the Philippines, this whole argument collapses. Europeans already knew about the Luzones. They knew our islands existed a full decade before the so-called discovery. Their own records prove it. Magellan had first-hand experiences with the people from these islands. So this whole idea that March 16, 1521 was a discovery, even from a purely European perspective, does not actually hold up against Europe's own documentation. So if what is now the Philippines was known to its own people for thousands of years, known to the rest of the world for centuries, and even known to Europeans a full decade before 1521, then maybe it's time that we look at what actually happened on that day. So if March 16, 1521 was not truly a discovery of what is now the Philippines, then what exactly was it? To answer this, let's take a look at what actually happened back in 1521. When Magellan's expedition finally reached the islands of the Visayas, they were not a fleet of, proud discoverers planting flags on a new land. They were desperate. They had been at sea for months. They were starving. They were dehydrated. They were dying. And then what happened? The people of the Visayas, our ancestors, saw these strangers in desperate need. And they helped them. They fed them. They sheltered them. They provided the supplies that kept them alive. So if the Visayans had not shown that generosity, that hospitality, the expedition might have ended right there and then, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now Magellan also had with him Enrique de Malacca, an enslaved interpreter from Southeast Asia. And when they arrived in the Visayas, Enrique was able to communicate with the local people, with the local Visayans in his own mother tongue, or what we now call Bahasa Melayu. So the bridge between the Europeans and our ancestors was not some European genius. It was actually a native Southeast Asian who had been enslaved at a young age and dragged across the world. Then came the Battle of Mactan. Magellan, emboldened by his early alliances, demanded that a local ruler, Lapu-Lapu, submit to Spanish authority, but Lapu-Lapu refused. And so, Magellan attacked. But within just 1 hour, Magellan was dead. But the story does not end here. The surviving crew, now leaderless, continued sailing their way around Southeast Asia, desperately trying to find their way to the Moluccas and eventually back to Europe. So a few months later, after Mactan, they encountered the Armada of the Sultanate of Brunei. It was a massive fleet with 200 warships, commanded by my own ancestor, Raja Ace, the Prince of Luzon. Raja Ace was the admiral of the Sultanate of Brunei and the grandson of the mighty Sultan Borkiya. And among Raja Ace's crew was Pasekulan, a freed slave from Makassar in what is now Indonesia, who actually spoke Spanish. Raja Ace provided Pasekulan as a navigator to guide the Europeans through the waters of Southeast Asia, so they wouldn't get lost on their way back home. Just think about that. The people who were so-called discovered had to guide their so-called discoverers back home. The expedition that supposedly found the Philippines could not have survived without the very people they claimed to have found, the very people they claimed to have discovered from obscurity. So, if that is what discovery looks like, being rescued, being fed, being guided, being kept alive by the very people you claim to have discovered, then what does the word even mean anymore? Now we've tested every definition, every argument, and every perspective of discovery, but not a single one was holding up. So, in essence, if the discovery of the Philippines in 1521 was not really about discovering the existence of our islands, what exactly was it about? To answer that, we have to go back to Europe, because while the Philippines was busy being connected to the rest of the world for thousands of years, something was happening in Europe that would forever change the meaning of the word discovery. So back in the 1400s, the Pope issued a series of papal bulls, or official decrees, that would later be known collectively as the Doctrine of Discovery. These documents gave European Catholic nations the legal authority to seize any lands that were not occupied by Christians. Any land where the people didn't follow the Christian faith was considered undiscovered, legally empty, regardless of how many people actually lived there, regardless of how long they had been living there. It didn't matter if you had 709,000 years of human presence on your land. It didn't matter if you had legal systems, trade networks, written documents, political alliances, and thriving civilizations for centuries. If you were not Christian, your land was legally undiscovered, up for grabs. Then came the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. With the blessing of the Pope, Spain and Portugal, just two European kingdoms, sat down and drew a line down the middle of the globe. Everything on one side belonged to Spain, and everything on the other side belonged to Portugal. They literally divided the entire world between themselves. No one else was consulted. No one else was asked. So when Magellan arrived in the Visayas in March of 1521, he was not discovering anything new. He was making a legal claim. He was planting a flag and saying, under the laws that we invented, this land now belongs to the King of Spain. That is what the so-called discovery always meant. Not a geographic achievement, not a feat of exploration, but a legal mechanism for colonialism, a word reinvented by empires to justify taking what was never theirs. For centuries, we were taught that the Philippines was discovered by Ferdinand Magellan on March 16, 1521. But our history did not begin in 1521. It did not begin with Magellan, it did not begin with Spain or any other colonial power. It began with us. It began with the very first humans to set foot on our islands hundreds of thousands of years ago. It began with the Aetas, the Austronesians, who built our cultures, our traditions, our languages thousands of years ago. It began with the traders, the scholars, the rulers who connected our islands to the outside world centuries ago. It began with our people, our ancestors, already thriving and making their mark on the global stage long before any European, lost at sea, starving at sea, needed to discover them. Remember Enrique de Malacca, the enslaved interpreter from Magellan's expedition in 1521, who may very well be the first person to circumnavigate the world. Now what happened to him after the Battle of Mactan in 1521 remains one of the world's wildest mysteries in our history. And I made an entire video digging deeper into the story. So make sure to watch it after this video. Maraming salamat po o in Kamampangan, dakal pong salamat kay Kongan, in Bicol, Diyos mabalos. See you next time o in Tagalog kita kits and in Kapampangan, Miki Tix and in Binisaya, kita Aeta.